Hello to everyone that's joining us. We are so sorry we had some technical difficulties, but we figured it out. And so thank you for joining us. We're going to wait just a few minutes, not even a few minutes. We're just going to wait about 30 seconds as this number continues to tick up as people join today's webinar. Feel free to use the chat feature to let us know where you're from. Say hello. We are so glad you're with us. All right. Well, let's go ahead and start talking a little bit. And so my name is Easton Davis, and I serve as the Director of Youth and Young Adult Ministries here in the Diocese of Atlanta, and I am serving as today's moderator. Welcome. And we are so thankful that you're here at this webinar sponsored by the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Healing. If this is your first Zoom webinar, you will notice it looks a little bit different. You will be able to see all the panelists on your screens. But you will not be able to use your video feature or your voice feature during the webinar. You can ask your questions in the Q&A section, and that's located at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. We encourage you to use that Q&A section to ask questions throughout the webinar, and we will get to those questions at the end. If you have a question, please include your name, your question, and if your question is directed towards a specific panelist, please include who that panelist is that you would like to ask that question to. And again, you can use the Zoom chat feature to comment, tell us who you are, etc. I want to reiterate to use the Q&A feature to ask questions to the panelists. And with that, it is my privilege to turn it over to Dr. Katherine Meeks, the Executive Director of the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Healing. Dr. Meeks, the floor is yours.
And can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
All right. Thanks be to God. Rainier Marie Rilke says that people try to organize their lives around the easy and the easiest of the easy. But the real challenge is to hold to the difficult. So we welcome all of you who have joined us today and invite you into holding to the difficult as we embrace two pandemics. The coronavirus pandemic, which arrived a few months ago, and racism, which has been here since 1619. And we know that one of the best ways to hold to the difficult in this time is to lament and to pay attention to how we really feel and where we really are. And I'm delighted to welcome all of you who are joining us, and especially delighted to welcome Bishop Robert Wright, who is the 10th Bishop of the Diocese of Atlanta, to help us with thinking through lament and pastoral care for this particular webinar. Bishop Wright.
Well, thank you, Dr. Meeks, and hello to everyone out there, and especially hello and to all of the panelists here that I get a chance to be alongside. Thank you to the Absalom Jones Center here because it continues to stay very close to its founding purpose, and that is to create brave space so we can linger long enough in what is real until we wring out the blessings that God would have us to have. I guess what I want to say as we begin to talk about lament is that this is a holy conversation. I think that this is a conversation not about sort of being down in the mouth and sad and sort of a sad sack. This is acknowledging how we are made in God's image. We are made in God's image, and which means we feel. And to feel is a very complicated idea, as we all know. And I think that when we talk about pandemics, what we're talking about, both the pandemic of racism and pandemic of COVID-19, what we're talking about really today is that there's loss. There's loss. And I think that what the church and what the spiritual muscles we want to flex are those we want to build and flex. Or what do we do when we face loss? What is in our toolbox? Well, first I want to say that To give voice to loss, to lament, is revolutionary behavior. Because what empire wants us to do is sort of suck it up, stiff upper lip, on all those words and ways that we know. No space for grieving, too busy for that, only giving perhaps the veneer of grief and lament as we press on. And what we know is that this creates a really negative effect, both in our psychological well-being, our spiritual well-being, and certainly in our physical well-being. And so the holy work that we want to do by talking about lament, acknowledging loss in all of its forms, is to participate in the cadence and rhythm that is a healing cadence and rhythm. And the healing cadence and rhythm is to fend off this sort of really one-dimensional understanding of what strength is. And strength is, and at least in the American system, is somehow to not acknowledge weakness or loss or vulnerability, but rather to perform invincibility, to armor up oneself. And I suppose that's fine, but it can be a pathology, and that's what we're talking about here. And what it can create is create a system where we never actually attain the spiritual maturity that Jesus would have us to obtain, and that our tradition wants us to obtain, that depth of spirit, those real facility with those tools. And so what happens when we don't do the hard work of lingering, do the hard work of acknowledging loss is that our breathing becomes full of mucus, so to speak. And if we never cough up that mucus, then we become sick past our own conscious acknowledgement that we are in fact sick. One of the ways one of the sort of practical things that happen to us when we don't find a way to acknowledge loss and grief is we become numb. And what numbness does is that we don't have it steals energy from us. So we don't have the actual energy to hope. What it does is that it lowers the ceiling height on our compassion and empathy for others. And so it never really positions us to complete the rhythm and the route that is our spiritual heritage. An example in our tradition would be Christ has died, Christ has risen, Christ will come again, the circular nature of that. But without you and I finding the courage to do the countercultural work of giving voice to loss, then we become sick. And when we're sick, we don't grow, and we don't attain the heights and depths and the breadth of fellowship that we're intended by virtue of being made in the image of God. So specifically, Dr. Meeks talked about 1619. So we've been denying the pain of an entire group of people since 1619. We've been diminishing it. We've been giving it short shrift. We've been asking people to do extraordinary things like pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, but denying people bootstraps. And we're seeing some of this cumulative effect of this denial on our streets in America right now. We've seen it. I'm 56 years old. We have seen police violence to Black and brown people for my entire life. I remember being instructed on how to manage these atrocities by my parents, and they had been instructed by their parents. And so what we're looking at now is a cumulative effect. We're looking at a release. Now, let me just hurry up and say, I in no way affirm violence either by the police or by protesters. But what I do understand is I understand the emotional release. I understand people needing to give voice to profound loss. And I think this is what is happening now. Also with COVID-19, I realize now after 11, almost 12 weeks in some places, that there is a profound sense of loss happening right now about our way of life, about our divisions, our political divisions, about the limits of our healthcare to reach all Americans, about the limits of designed limits to not provide education to all of America's children. And so you have an incredible sense of loss that is building up in the system. And my investment in today's conversation is to talk with people and to affirm and raise the expectation level, certainly in our spiritual communities, the Episcopal Church specifically, about how do we do pastoral care at this time. And so I suppose the last thing I'll say before throwing it to my co-panelists here would be, I want to make a distinction here. I want to make a distinction between pastoral care of an individual, the important hand-holding, the coming alongside, the at the bedside, the in the IC unit. I'm not talking about that. That's all good, and we need to increase our capacity to do that and do that well. What we're talking about now is how do you and I begin to develop processes by which institutions, organizations, and groups of people develop a way to give voice to the lost, maybe even a loss that is unconscious for them, but to develop reliable healing processes so people can, I refer back to that mucus, cough up this mucus and breathe again. And so I'll sort of leave that there and throw back to Dr. Meeks, and I look forward to talking some more with everybody about that.
Thank you, Bishop Wright. Can you hear me, Easton? Okay,
we can. Yeah, you're good. We can hear you just fine. Yeah, you're
can you
good.
see me?
We can see you on. Yeah, we can see you on your computer. We can keep this video off on your phone. That was the technical difficulty we were having, was getting Katherine's audio working. So you're good to go.
So everybody needs to know, first of all, that I'm a neophyte with all of this technology business, and I'm an old lady learning a lot of new tricks here. And so you just have to, it's what the times are calling us to learn new stuff, to ask new questions, to be made over, no matter how old we are. And so I'm doing my best to say yes to all of that. And I think that that's what we're all being invited into. So just be patient as we learn to do some new stuff. So the part of the idea behind this set of webinars was not only to talk about lament, but to talk about the people that we have forgotten about. And then we had the audacity to call them essential when we decided that we needed them to help us try to keep our lives as normal as possible. But we don't really think that they are essential. We think that they're expendable. And that's why we have put them out. It's like, as I said last week, we put the canary in the mine to see if the air is okay to breathe. And if the canary dies, we know we need to leave. And so the majority culture understood quite well that the folks that we call essential are the canaries in the mine, and we don't care if they die, but we need them out here to bring us our grocery and our medicine, and we need them to pick up the trash, and we need them to do all the jobs that they do all the time. And they are expendable, but we call them essential. Isn't that just the way we like to do things? And isn't that just something that flies in God's face? Because those are God's beloved children, and God is not happy about that. So one of the things we wanted to do was to make sure that we remember those people, that we say to them, we don't have any expendable people in this country. We don't have any people that we can throw away. We have got to stop thinking that way. And so today we've asked 3 speakers to speak about some of those folks that we try to throw away. And I want to invite Dr. Roxanna Chica, who is a registered nurse and has worked with farm workers, to talk some about the farm workers and some of the plights of those folks. And then following her would be Reverend Isaiah Brokenleg, who is the missioner, I think the bishop's, presiding bishop staff officer for racial reconciliation for the Episcopal Church, and Reverend Brad Hauff, who is the missioner for Indigenous people for the Episcopal Church, to speak about, Roxanna will talk about farm workers, and Reverend Brokenleg and Reverend Hauff will talk about Indigenous people for a bit, and then we will have some time for your questions after that, and some more conversation with all of our speakers. So, Roxanna.
Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be here and share a little bit of the work that I do. So I think that Dr. Meeks, what you said is very important, that we have treated a group of people as expendable, but now in the era of COVID-19, they're essential. And that kind of shows how we as a society have somewhat failed in protecting our most vulnerable populations. And so I just want to give a history of agricultural workers or people who have worked in the field. It can be traced all the way back to the times of slavery, when Africans were brought to the United States and forced into slavery. And then after slavery ended, a few years later, there was a need for people to work in the fields. And so that need was filled by people from China and Japan, Asia. And so when that need was filled, and then people, it was decided that there was just too many of them, there were some immigration policies that were put in place to stop the immigration of people from China and Japan. And so then, World War I happened, and then we had another shortage of labor. And so people from Mexico started to fill that need. And so now that need is somewhat has been met. And so now, again, as a continued pattern, there are immigration policies that are being pushed into place to try to stop people from Latin America from filling those jobs, and are being have been characterized as horrible things like criminals and all these other awful things. And so who are the workers today in the United States that labor in the fields and bring us our fresh salads and vegetables and fruits? And they are still predominantly foreign-born workers. About 80% of them are from Latin America. They have very limited English proficiency, have an average education of 8 years, and they make about $15,000 a year. And they work 8 to 12 hours a day, often 7 days a week, because when you need to pick crops, you have to do it as fast as you can. Several of them are paid what they call by the piece, which means essentially time is money. So you will see them in the fields rushing back and forth. They will forgo taking breaks, lunch breaks, drinking water, to try to make enough money to get by. They are exempt from many labor protections. Still in the 21st century, they do not have heat protection standards or benefits to many other protections that other workers have. And during COVID-19, there was a stop of immigration, and there was this uproar in the agricultural industry that there would not be enough workers to fill the demand. And so they lifted the limitations on what we call H-2A workers, which are agricultural workers who come into the United States just for a season, work, and then they go back. And so there's those workers, and then you have a lot of undocumented workers who are agricultural workers, and a few that, and some that are do have documents. But even though all agricultural workers live a very hard life, their working conditions are bad, and their housing conditions are bad. They live in crowded areas where sometimes they share a communal bathroom amongst 10 workers, 4 or 5 workers into one room, and they make very little money. And so and they have continued to work during COVID-19 because you can't pick your Vidalia onions through Zoom. You have to be out there, right? And the government has given some kind of guidance to help to try to protect workers, but this also falls into that pattern that of just providing guidance. So, for example, workers, don't have heat protection standards, but there is guidance of that they should drink water and they should take breaks and rest in the shade, but nothing is enforceable. And that really comes back from this notion that started long time ago, and that continues to perpetuate in our society, and that people of color, have this superior capacity to tolerate heat and work in really harsh conditions. And some have gone to the extent to think that, it's actually something wholesome and like beneficial exercise for people of color working in these harsh environments. And so I think that the COVID-19 pandemic has, and something else, they're essential workers, and the hypocrisy is so much that some of these workers have been given letters saying that they are essential workers, so that if they are stopped by ICE, Immigration Customs Enforcement, they cannot be deported. So because of COVID-19, because they're so essential. But before COVID-19, we were like in a rush to try to deport everyone out. So I think also what COVID-19 has done is brought an awareness of disparities of occupational protection and safety, as well as health, especially in the food supply industry. And so we know that disparities among minorities and immigrant populations is compromised. It has been compromised for so long because of our social and political capita, continues to be oppressed by different types of policies that are in place. And this has resulted in a lot of premature deaths and disease burden and lack of access to healthcare. We can look at many statistics and show how disease burden is worse on minority populations. And COVID-19 has shown that, again, more African Americans and Hispanics are dying from COVID-19. And there are lots of agricultural workers who are also dying and are contracting the disease, but we don't know about it because the media is not really interested about it. And that kind of goes in the pattern where agricultural workers are 20 times more likely to die of heat stroke. And when a worker dies in the fields, it's not reported. But if it were an athlete, it would be all over the news media. Mm-hmm. And so I think that agricultural workers, really, we need to start thinking more about them. I think a lot of times we don't think about how our food gets to our table. We just think it just kind of plops there, and don't think about, how workers are really being affected by the harsh working conditions. And in South Georgia, there has been some outbreaks of COVID-19 amongst agricultural workers. And again, no one knows about it. This is all I know about it because that's part of my circle. But other people haven't even thought about agricultural workers. And so they try to, the industry tries to keep it very contained so that we don't know about it. And so my hope is that perhaps right now that this awareness is being brought about agricultural workers, and we see some kind of kindness or respect for agricultural workers, that when this is over, I hope the society doesn't forget about the contributions the agricultural workers give to this country, and that when you go out and vote for a moment, just think about how your vote will impact larger society.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you, Roxanna.
Thank you.
Yes, Reverend Brokenleg, we can let Father Brad go first.
There we go. Let me unmute myself there. Thank you, Shaniqua, and thank you, Katherine. I want to begin with a Lakota greeting. How mutaki epi. How mutaki epi means hello, relatives. I'm Brad Hauff. I'm a member of the Oglala Lakota Oyate, originally from South Dakota, the Oglala Sioux tribe. Oglala is a word that means the scattered people. Both of my parents are also tribal members, and they were raised in the residential or the boarding schools for Indian children in South Dakota. My father was raised in the government boarding school in Pine Ridge, and my mother was raised in St. Mary's Episcopal School for Indian Girls in Springfield, South Dakota. It was difficult for me growing up with my siblings and my parents because my parents are both raised in institutions. They were not raised in nuclear family settings and really did not have a lot of parenting models or skills. So that's made life challenging, at least my early life, quite challenging. I am now the presiding bishop's missioner for Indigenous ministries for the Episcopal Church. The Episcopal Church has had a relationship with Indigenous people since before there was an Episcopal Church. We first came into contact with Anglican chaplains of Sir Francis Drake back in the 1570s on the West Coast in what is now the San Francisco Bay Area, Drake's Bay, where the chaplains came in contact with the Ohlone people who were still there. And then there was the Jamestown colony settled in 1607, where some of our tribal members were baptized into the Anglican Christian expression. And we have had a very conflicted, problematic, heartbreaking, and tragic relationship with the church. And it goes all the way back to the Doctrine of Discovery. We've been struggling with racism since 1492. Racism came over here across the ocean from Europe. And it was empowered and encouraged by religion, namely the Christian faith, through the Doctrine of Discovery, which is a series of papal bulls or edicts from the bishops of Rome in the 15th century, calling upon the monarchs of European nations to go forth and conquer the lands and the peoples of Africa and the Western Hemisphere. And that is what happened. It all started with the church giving its blessing to what later became a process of genocide, land theft, and slavery. Those awful atrocities, my friends, had their origins in the Christian church. And that is something that we really need to come to terms with. In our own country's history, the United States, if you've read the Declaration of Independence, you might recall that in that document, which founded our country, it says that the rights guaranteed to all men do not apply to the merciless Indian savages. That's a direct quote from the Declaration of Independence, the merciless Indian savages. We were specifically written out of the Declaration of Independence. Now, there are some folks who say, oh, I've got that all wrong, that our government hadn't been founded yet, and it was just their way of recognizing the sovereign independence of Indian tribes as their own nations at that time, and that there was no ill will behind that. But I don't think so. If that were the case, then why did the government, once it was founded, not honor our sovereign independence at all? Instead, the plan and the strategy that went forth was one to take our land and annihilate us. And that happened all the way up until the late 19th century in this country. We were the last group to be made citizens of the United States. That didn't happen until 1924. And we didn't have the right to vote up until that point. And we didn't have full freedom of religion until 1978, under the Jimmy Carter administration. That's when that was granted to us under the American Indian Freedom of Religion Act in 1978. Within our lifetimes, most of us who are here, we didn't have freedom of religion in this country. So I think that there was ill will, definitely, that was there. We are survivors of genocide. We are survivors of a genocidal process going back to the Doctrine of Discovery and the 1400s, in which we were almost completely annihilated. we were almost completely annihilated. It's estimated that the population of indigenous people in what is now called the United States was in the tens of millions before 1492. In the year 1890, some 400 years later, it was less than 250,000 indigenous people in what is now known as the United States. That's what genocide looks like statistically. So we have been struggling just to continue to go forth with our lives, and it has been extraordinarily difficult. I don't know how you survive genocide and move forward from there. But we've been trying to do that, and we've encountered a number of significant problems in our quest for survival, namely poverty, discrimination, substance abuse, health problems, chronic health problems resulting from a change in our diet, the loss of our land. And that makes us extraordinarily vulnerable to a pandemic. And some of our tribes have been wiped out by epidemics in the past, and pathogens introduced into the population. And we're very sensitive about that. But COVID has the possibility of doing extensive damage to our indigenous communities. And as it tends to kill older people, it's killing and going to kill our elders. Our elders. And our elders have been the guardians and the keepers of our traditions, our spiritual lives, and our languages. So if we lose our elders, we're going to lose those things, and those things are really all that we have left. So indigenous people are profoundly concerned about what's happening. My colleague Shaniqua has a background in public health, among other things, and can give us detailed information about our situation as far as healthcare services are concerned, among other things. So I'll leave it up to her. Alamia, thank you.
Thank you, Brad, and thank you everyone else who's spoken. My name's Isaiah Brokenleg, but I go by my nickname, Shaniqua, and I'm an enrolled member of the Rosebud Sioux tribe. We call ourselves Sichanhu, so like Brad's Ogallala, we're Sichanhu, and ours means burnt eye because there was a fire one time we had to run through the prairie, and we all got burnt in the process to get away from the fire. That's where that name comes from. And Brad will tell you it's because he was coming after us, but I actually don't remember the whole story, but we like to joke back and forth because our tribes are right next to each other. I'm the staff officer for racial reconciliation. I currently live in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And as Brad said, prior to becoming a priest, I worked as an epidemiologist, serving the Great Lakes area of Indian country for over 10 years. Some of the things that I just wanted to touch on that I think are really important, and I actually don't know how long I have, so somebody message me when I talk too long, with historical trauma. And that is a piece that I think is part of the reason why we still have what's going on. So Brad talked about the doctrine of discovery, and historical trauma is when, if you think about generations of people, as we get more generations, we pass on what I like to think of as cultural DNA to the next generation. Those are all the things that you learn from your grandmas and aunties and uncles and family that tell you this is how we handle conflict. This is what it means to be a member of our community. This is the expectation being in our community. These are all our traditional teachings and things. Think of maybe as formation. So historical trauma happens when something interrupts that cultural DNA transmission. And in our case, it was government policies and boarding schools. But you have things like slavery and the Holocaust, Japanese internment. There's all sorts of other times when we have that historical trauma. And so every generation after that, they're passing on all of those negative things that they learned or experienced in boarding school or wherever. And so you have like the abuse and the deep sense of loss, the not necessarily feeling like they're Indian enough, fear of other certain groups of people, addiction, all of that stuff. And when people sometimes ask us, why can't we just over it? It was so long ago. It's because until you heal from that generational trauma, that same stuff is going to keep coming up on consecutive generations in the future. Sorry, I got off track. I think sometimes too, another thing that happens as American Indian people and Indigenous people, we're often invisible. People don't even realize that we're there, that we exist. We're often left out of all of the health data. If you look at a lot of the surveys and graphs, you'll see what it is. Here's white, black, Latino, Latina, and then there's this other that we're kind of lumped in with that's not really helpful for anyone. And so we don't always have access to those. They didn't even know about what's going on. There's a theory called the people's theory that says, as you lose your culture, you lose your health. And that has been very true for American Indian people and other cultures as well. I would even argue European cultures. You lose your culture, you become this rugged individualism, which then you lose your sense of community, your sense of belonging and all of that, and it just becomes this downward spiral. In our case, you took away our way of life, our subsistence patterns, and provide us with food that's high in salt, sugar, and fat. Well, what's going to happen? We're going to get diabetes. We're going to have heart disease. We're going to have, strokes, all of those things. And you're going to see this huge health disparity. So we see them in rates of diabetes, cancer, heart disease, suicide. And I think those disparities in most communities of color, because there's huge disparities between white folks and communities of color and health outcomes. And those are a symptom of the racism and structural violence that is happening to communities of color. In Indian country, there's Indian Health Service, and we spend more per person on the healthcare of federal prisoners than we do on the healthcare of American Indians. And the government is bound by several treaties to provide healthcare to American Indians. And I'm not saying that people in prison don't deserve good quality healthcare, because I believe everybody deserves good quality healthcare. But shouldn't American Indians get at least the same amount as the federal prisoners? I don't understand that at all. For every dollar that the Indian Health Service needs to provide care, they get 50 cents. That's what we get. And in situations like COVID, there's been a problematic response where the states aren't coordinating with the reservations and the government on the reservations to provide care and to figure out how we're working together. In many cases, there's a lot of conflicting things, like in South Dakota here, tribes are trying to protect themselves, and we have the governor who is not allowing the tribe to continue to have the checkpoints to prevent the spread of COVID. What else was I going to say? There were some other pieces I was going to talk about. Resource extraction, I think, is also an issue when it comes to health and health outcomes. There's been places in Alaska where they've had to move the whole village 4 miles inland, and they did that several years ago. Now they're having to move it again because of the melt that's coming in and it's removing their stuff. They have times when certain cycles of animals that they might hunt or things they gather, they've had to change when they have to do those things because of climate change. Or I know many of you maybe even responded to what was going on with the DAPL and the pipeline in North Dakota. Things like that are occurring. On a positive note, that people's theory also says, as you gain your culture, as you gain your sense of community, as you do community engagement, you will also gain your health. And so it's not hopeless. We can do that if we think about how we do that. Let's see, 2 other things I want to say, and then I'll be done. One is in Lakota, there's almost no translation for the phrase, I love you. Instead, we usually say Techihila, and Tehi means to suffer or to endure, and Chi means like me to you. And adding la makes it endearing. And so Techihila literally means I will suffer for you. And so anytime we say the word I love you, we are reminded of the action that we need to do because of it. And as people of Christ who are called to love each other, that means there should be an action behind that as well, right? That we should be willing or able to suffer or endure for each other because we love them. And I think Christ is a great example of that. So with that, I will say I stand with you and I agree with you, and I'm ready to support you as we lament and as we work together to be the hands and feet of Christ in the world.
Thank you. Thank you. So before we go to questions and answers, I want to say all of the donations that we get from these webinars will be donated to our Latinx and Native Indigenous sisters and brothers. So we want you to donate generously to the Center for Racial Healing so that we can then share those donations with folks that have incredible needs. And even though whatever we give will be small in comparison to what they need, it will be a statement from some other folks to them that they are thought about and cared about. So, and all of the information for donating is available to you as Easton has put it up. So please go to our website, and hit the donate button and give what you can afford, and know that it's going to be sent on to help some folks who have far less than most of us have. So now I'd like to turn to the questions, and Easton is moderating for us and sort of ferreting out those questions. And so if you have a question and you didn't ask it yet, please do so. And Easton, what do we have?
Yeah, I think this is a great question to get started. It's Brandon Beck from St. Mark's in San Marcos, Texas, for each person. So maybe we can just start at the top left and go around. But please recommend books on the topics you shared. Any genre welcome: history, memoir, theology, activism, poetry, justice and faith. So social justice. What do you guys got for them?
Could I jump in? I want to say something that I hope that it connects with everyone. I'm so struck by the presenters here, and I'm so struck that everybody sort of on these panels represents a denial of facts on the ground, right? And so I think that this is why this conversation is so important. If you look at Walter Brueggemann's actually his commentary on Jeremiah called "A Fire Shut Up in Your Bones," if you look at the back page, he names the poet as someone who has extraordinary sensitivity to pain. And so I think that this is what we're talking about here. We're talking about groups, Hispanic people, people who are working to provide food for us. We're talking about what we've labeled essential workers. We're talking about the first people of this land. We're talking about people who are brought here to do labor. We're talking about a group of people who have been systematically denied dignity and all the rights that treaties and constitutions have said that they were worthy of. But I just want to hold that up as the prophet is not necessarily sort of someone who's always sort of shaking their hand at the power system, but is one who has an incredible sensitivity to pain, God's pain, as well as people's pain, and gives that voice. And so when we're talking about lament and drawing together, I think that's important. And to see how that is actually all through our tradition. The book I would recommend is another book by Brueggemann called Reality, Grief, and Hope. Reality, Grief, and Hope, 3 urgent prophetic tasks for the church. And Brueggemann says that if we don't get better in walking people through that cycle, being able to take a look at reality, right, as opposed to ideology, our national mythology, but reality, facts on the ground, to register grief and loss and lament as a way to finally and authentically get to hope, then we're sunk. And so I offer his thoughts to us as we continue to think about the subject.
All right. What other books do we recommend?
I kind of wrote in the chat, but I'll just say it so everybody can hear it. There's a book by Beth Holmes, who's a medical anthropologist, called Fresh Fruits, Broken Bodies. And he really goes through explains the suffering of agricultural workers in the United States, and really starts from travels with a group of workers from Mexico who are indigenous who come into the United States.
Roxanna, who's the author again?
Beth Holmes.
And we'll send out this in a follow-up email as well. So you'll have these book titles in a follow-up email that you'll get probably tomorrow morning as a follow-up.
I would say anything by Vine Deloria Jr., who's written numerous books over the years. He actually is the son of Vine Deloria Sr., who was the first Indigenous missioner for the Episcopal Church. I think he was the first Native American theologian, I think, to be popularly published with his books, Custer Died for Your Sins, and God is Red. So anything by Vine Deloria Jr., anything by Bishop Stephen Charleston of Oklahoma, a prolific author, and his reflections are featured on a daily basis on my office's Facebook page, which is called Native American and Indigenous Ministries of the Episcopal Church. It's on Facebook, Native American and Indigenous Ministries of the Episcopal Church. And then another one, if you're interested in genocide in the population, a book called 1491, The Americas Before Columbus is a good one. 1491, The Americas Before Columbus. There are many, many others, but those are just some that come to mind.
All right, Easton.
All right. Next question we've got is from Karen. That's my colleague from Kansas, and she asked, "What prayer do y'all use for lament?" Or sorry, what scripture do y'all use when you're praying for lament?
And she wants anybody to answer this question?
I think that was for anyone to answer it.
Well, before they answer, let me just encourage this person to go back and listen at the former webinars where we had much talk about the Psalms and Lamentations, and people writing their own Psalm of Lament. If you didn't hear those, that would be helpful. I don't want to put words in the panelists' mouths, but there was a lot of discussion about that in those two previous webinars.
Sure, and I'll say the obvious, and that's the Psalms, the most emotionally honest pieces of scripture that we have. I think that's important to watch people be emotionally honest about feeling abandoned by God. I think that any good Christian preacher worth their salt doesn't give those ideas and those texts short shrift, but invites people to linger there and to talk about the times they felt abandoned. I think that is really, really helpful. I think when from my sort of familiarity, I think when you look at African American and the Negro hymnody, I think you get a really rich tradition. I imagine the Native American population has some such. We remember that the blues were born in the church and then made their way to the bar, but the purpose is the same, is to give pain a voice. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. If you've ever heard people really sing that, you know that how the vowels are stretched out really long. It becomes a communal lament. You're invited into a space to give over your pain and begin to exercise it. And so I think music continues to be huge.
Go ahead.
From the Indigenous perspective, there is a hymn in the hymnal 1982 called Many and Great. And it is based on a Dakota Indian chant. The lyrics are in English, of course, but the original lyrics were in Dakota. It's a very short hymn. I think it's only 2 stanzas, the way they have it in the hymnal. And when you look at the lyrics, it doesn't look like it would be a lament. It looks more like a song of praise to God the Creator, and it is. But it is the song that was chanted by the Dakota 38, who went to their deaths to the gallows in Mankato in 1862, the largest mass public execution in United States history, I believe, to this day. 38 Dakota men whose only crime was that they were hungry because they were starving and tried to get food the best way that they could. And that's how it started. When they went to their deaths, they were chanting that hymn. They were chanting that hymn, Many and Great. And so when we do it in Indigenous communities, it's done in a very solemn manner, as a lament, in remembrance of them, honoring them. And so that's, it's very moving when it's experienced that way.
We've got a question from Wayne. What are some actions you can recommend in this time of racial tension? And unless I give you a panelist name, that is open for all panelists to answer.
What was the question again?
What are some actions you can recommend in this time of racial tension?
The Episcopal Church, I can put it in the chat, just put out a document that we worked on called Learn, Pray, Act, and it has resources in that area of things you can do. I think it's really important. Let me get that link. I think it's really important that we, the biggest thing I think that I really want to drive home is not to be silent. I think far too often our church has been silent when things have come up. And I know a lot of people are like, well, we'll wait and see, or I don't want to get in the way, or I don't know, whatever. Silence only hurts the people who are oppressed. It does not hurt the oppressor. And so get out there, let people know that you see them, let people know that you support them, and don't be silent.
In addition to not being silent, I also want to really encourage people to pay attention to what you are doing in terms of making sure that it's really what you need to be doing, and not what you're doing because somebody else is doing it, or because of some reasons that you're not very grounded in. We don't need people to be knee-jerky. We don't need people to just be up and running around like you haven't been thinking and reflecting. That's a part of the reason why the lament piece is so important, because in the middle of lamenting, hopefully you can pay some attention to where your heart really is. And what we need, in addition to people speaking up and standing up, is for people to be speaking up and standing up out of real places of their own personal integrity, so that when next week comes and next year comes, you won't have to wait for somebody to be murdered in the street to decide that racism is a problem. And we've got to start having sustainable behavior here that works toward moving us somewhere. And that happens when people get grounded in understanding that you want to be a person who resists oppression and racism, and not just in terms of pandemics, but that you've resisted every day with every part of yourself. And you have to come to those conclusions yourself, every person listening and thinking about this. So I want to really encourage that work as you go forward too.
Can I chime in? There was a question about what resources do you recommend in terms of sort of convening lament. I would say that the people who know me know that I don't sort of give those kinds of answers, but what I would do is I would point you to the great litany in our tradition, and I would ask you to sort of begin to sort of write out those things that we're lamenting. One of the exercises I've invited congregations in my diocese to do is to develop their own lists of things that they want to name as loss. Because I think what we're trying to do is we're trying to pastor people, and by pastoring people, you're trying to get them to be reflective. It's wonderful. A wonderful gift that Shaniqua gave us today was, as we reclaim our culture, we reclaim our health, and part of our Christian heritage is to provide litany, lament, confess, and absolution. And so I would invite you to bring your wonderful imagination, whoever wrote that question. Use your wonderful imagination. Use our great litany as a bit of a guide and template, and then turn it around. Certainly to also ask your group, whatever group you're connected to, can we name some loss? It's amazing that people have not had any sort of real deep reflection on this kind of thing. I mean, it's hovering. It's like a low-grade fever. It's there. And so people sort of get triggered in Facebook and other places. But that's very different from actually sitting with what have I lost? What am I losing? And getting that out and getting that sort of going in the community.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Okay. I've got a question from Katherine, and Katherine would like to ask some concrete ways to help Indigenous people. Any suggestions on resources, contacts for providing pastoral care to Native peoples?
Sometimes when I give presentations and people respond in that way and do it defensively, because they'll hear about what really happened to Indigenous people historically in this country, and defensively their response will be, well, what do you expect us to do? Give the land back? And no, that's not what our expectation is. But we would like you to acknowledge that that land once was ours, once was our home. And so that really started a movement in the church called the acknowledgement, which many churches are doing right now. They are either making it a part of their prayers of the people, or they're putting it on their web pages or in their bulletins or newsletters, essentially saying that, acknowledging that the land upon which their church is built was once the home of an Indigenous people, and it was taken away from them. Mm-hmm. And then honoring those people and praying for them, and praying for justice and reconciliation to be served. That doesn't take much to do that, but it means so much. Because we've been forgotten by most of the people in this country. We're considered to be relics of the past. We have been reduced to sports mascots who aren't really people. But we're still around. There are over 6 million of us today, and we're everywhere in this country. Most of us don't live on reservations anymore. We live in urban metropolitan areas. So to just acknowledge that that what you think is your home was actually the home of someone else who was there, and they lost it. It was taken away from them. And if you don't know what tribe, there's a website called Native Land. Native Land. That's simply called Native Land, and I believe it's an app for your device as well. All you have to do is type in your zip code, and it will take you to a map and tell you the tribes who are living there and who lost their land. Wherever you are in the United States, it will do that. So acknowledging, as Shanika was saying, not being silent, but acknowledging what happened. That doesn't take too much to do, but it can be so healing and transforming.
I think some things that I think about when I think about providing pastoral care, if you're a chaplain in a hospital, do you have policies that allow American Indians to pray in the way that they need to? So a lot of people need to smudge, which is like burning sage, and a lot of hospital policies won't allow that to happen. Do you have policies about sacred objects that might be in the room with Native people if they're in the hospital? Do you support tribal sovereignty? Do you let your elected leaders know that you support tribal sovereignty and that you care about these issues? Another really big one is missing and murdered Indigenous women and people. There's a huge problem, and the Violence Against Women Act needs to be reauthorized, because when it went through, it left out Alaska and a couple of other areas. And what was happening was tribes are not allowed to prosecute people who come on the reservation and commit crimes unless they're American Indian. So a white person can come on the reservation, rape a woman, and leave with impunity. Like, nobody's going to do anything about it, because the only person who could do it would be the FBI, and that's not important enough for them. They don't even come sometimes when people are murdered. And so VAWA would allow give some power to the tribal police to come and arrest those folks and hold them accountable. But it's not where it needs to be, and it definitely needs to be made better.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. This question is for all panelists. Does lament require an answer? Yeah, I'll let you guys sit on that one for a minute.
I can get it started. Again, I think we take our cue from hymnody. I think we take our cue from the Psalms. I think the first work of lament is acknowledging pain, acknowledging loss and grief. I think, and trying to give that voice, which is a constructive way to channel that energy, right? So I think that's first and foremost. I think we have to start getting it said, start going in the lament direction rather than just a numbness direction. I think this is what is absolutely a corrosive to the body and to the mind and to the soul, is just keep swallowing it until we become incredibly numb and we never live the life that God has intended for us. We never become the alive creatures that certainly Jesus wanted us to be, and with his life abundant and model. So I think that's first. As for answer, I think that's one of the things we do together, right? By coughing it up together, by participating in that rhythm. Brueggemann talks about, if we can linger long enough in that darkness, then this is where we begin to see that at the bottom we don't break, we bounce. We begin to see that God is trustworthy in darkness. And so, I think that it's a part of a liturgy. You have to begin to start coughing it up. So no, I don't think it's a one-to-one lament to answer. Certainly, the suffering of the Hebrews in Egypt shows us, 400 years. Native people here for, again, since the 15th century. We here since 1619, and others, right? So I think it's not. I like to tell people all the time that God is not microwave popcorn, right? That's not how that works, right? Put the request in, and 3 minutes later we get X. But I think it's about a journey with a God who walks us through. And this is not good news for many of us, but God shows amazing patience, and yet God does call out of these terribly dark places the amazing and extraordinary examples of healing, wholeness, courage, fidelity, etc. And we see this in all kinds of people. So yeah, I think we just had to, first of all, get it out. And I think this is, again, what's happening in the streets nowadays. We've got to get it out. We've got to stop saying this is okay. We've got to stop colluding with this stuff. We've got to. And so I saw a question. Let me just tack on, and then I'll be quiet. I always hear questions from my white brothers and sisters who acknowledge their privilege. And I so appreciate your sensitivity to that. I so appreciate your privilege. But I'm asking you to use your privilege. Use the privilege, right? Don't get caught up in this terrible cul-de-sac where you just acknowledge it and lament your privilege. We know you have privilege. We've been paying attention for a long time. Use it. I think that there are places that you could bring your privilege where you can be heard, that many people on this panel would be written off immediately, right? So I'm asking you to actively use your privilege as a gift, right? To give voice to stuff that you see on the ground, this disparity, the sickness, right? The brutality, abuse. So I'll stop there. But I think you have, my favorite theologian is James Brown, a great soul singer from Augusta, Georgia, who said, you got to use what you got to get what you want. And if you've got white privilege, use it, because we need it. We need it to be channeled in constructive, positive ways that change systems.
I was going to say that I think lament, I don't think necessarily requires an answer as much as it requires a presence. Like, I think as much as it requires a community. I think if you look at Job, he was in the worst of situations, and all of his friends came, but they weren't present with him. They just wanted to try and change everything, and they kept trying to cheer him up and ask him all these things. They just kind of like, no, and then they all leave. I think lament requires presence. Doesn't necessarily have to do anything, just be with them. And I think as ministers, whether lay or ordained, right, because we're all baptized and we're all ministers, I think sometimes we feel this need to try and cheer things up and make everything better, rather than just being present with the people in their suffering and standing with them in that, or maybe crying with them in that. And just to echo Bishop Wright, the song is so powerful. And I know, like, for Lakota people, we drum when we sing often, and there is a beat, like there's a regular beat that you might think of when we hear it that's more fast. But then when it's a serious time and you're in mourning, or it's lament, or it's a serious song like a flag song where we remember all our veterans who died, the beat is very slow. And it's to remind us and call us that this is a serious time. This is a time that we all need to remember those. And even if you are alone, you still have presence in lament, because you're there with your ancestors. You're there with the people who love you. Every time we're taking communion, we're there with our ancestors too.
When Jesus was dying on the cross, he said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And I know that's in Psalm 22, and scholars are saying that that's probably what he was doing, was reciting that psalm. But I can't help but believe that that came genuinely from his heart, that as he was losing his life, he felt that God had abandoned him. That's extraordinarily profound, an extraordinarily profound lament. And to come from someone whom we believe is our Lord and Savior and God's Son, that's extraordinary. But what was the answer to that? The answer to that was, in my view, the resurrection, the transforming power of new life, which means that God didn't abandon Jesus after all, but that had to be shown, demonstrated later on. I found that in my life, the times when I've actually been closest to God, or God has been closest to me, have been the times when I felt abandoned and forsaken and frustrated and angry at a God who I think doesn't listen to my prayers. And sometimes I've gotten so angry that I've just yelled at God and said things that I wouldn't want to repeat on this call. And God is there, and God listens. And God's big enough to take whatever anger I might throw at God. And God stays and proves to me that God never left. So that's, I think, if a lament is heartfelt and honest, what will result from it is an abiding presence of God in the person's life.
All right, so we touched on this a little bit, but let's see if there's any more responses from our panelists. But this is from Caitlin, and touching on how do we move from lament? How do we catalyze that and move from lament to hope into action?
So I think that something that we can do, I feel like often we look at things through the lens of like progress. And I think that we should start looking at things from the lens of like the least of these. Yes, there's been lots of progress for minorities, but if you look at it from the lens of the least of these, there's still a lot of suffering. Poverty is still high, disease. And so I think that if we look at things from the lens of, how people are suffering, then perhaps we would change our behavior and how we vote and engage with society at large. To be cognizant of how every action oftentimes affects the most vulnerable.
And I have said over and over, the best way to be ready for what's coming next is to engage what is present, what is happening. And some of the time we spend a lot of time trying to imagine our way, daydream our way into the future so that we don't have to deal with the present. And I think that that does not work well. Even if we pull it off in the present moment, when we get to the next moment, we're not ready. So that's why if you think I'm evangelistic about lament, you're right, because we have got to be in this present moment and feel the pain, the loss, the fear, the rage, all of those things in order to really be ready to embrace hope. And we don't need to be trying to get to hope without doing this piece. And sometimes we really do try to do that.
Yeah, it's a great temptation to jump from Good Friday to Easter Sunday, right?
Yes.
And I always remind people, the hope is in our rhythm, right? And so the rhythm is, the silence, what I call the soul-sucking silence of the Saturday, right? Which is in between the thorns and the piercing and the nails of Friday and the resurrection Sunday. And it's hard to linger there in that Saturday, especially in the church. We get busy putting lilies around and getting all our finery ready, et cetera. We actually disrupt and avoid, Saturday. And Saturday, really, that quiet, having to linger in that quiet will tell you more about who you are than the pain of Friday or even the alleluia of Sunday. But we resist it. We fend off that silence. And so I love the point that was made about walking with people, being beside people, and not rushing to this fake notion and sometimes just saccharine notion of progress. The truth of the matter is that life and death is a slog, and it's just difficult, and especially in the Western mind and context, we're really in a hurry to avoid that stuff. Mm-hmm. We're really, really in a hurry to avoid that stuff, and we could learn a lot from other cultures about how to linger and how to be with.
Mm-hmm. So Easton, maybe we have time for one more question.
Yeah, let's see here. I've got one more question right here. Well, I did. Oh, actually, it looks like that one went away. It must have been, someone must have answered it. Our panelists have done a great job today of answering the questions. I'm not used to that. So thank you for typing some responses. It's thrown me off a little bit because I've been looking for the questions and they disappear. You guys are on it. So Katherine, I think that really about does it for the questions that we have today.
Oh, well then what I'd like to do is ask the panelists if you have a last word, and then I will say one last word and we'll be done on time. And so we can start with you, Bishop Rob.
I've said plenty. I want to hear what Dr. Roxanna has to say for her last words.
Okay, I have a favorite quote by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And it says, we have deluded ourselves into believing the myth that capitalism grew and prospered out of the Protestant ethic of hard work and sacrifice. The fact is that capitalism was built on the exploitation and suffering of Black slaves and continues to thrive on the exploitation of the poor, both Black and white, both here and abroad.
Thank you.
I just want to say Pelamia, which is thank you to all of you, and reaffirm what I said before, that you are all my relatives, that we are all relatives of each other. that is something that I believe applies universally across Indigenous tribes throughout the world. The understanding, the belief, the conviction that we are all connected, we are all related. We all have the same blood running through our veins, all of creation. And that means that we have a responsibility to one another. And to never forget that. To never forget that. When you look at everyone around you and all the animals and the birds and the fish and the trees and the grass and the sky and the planets, those are all our relatives. And if you haven't lived your life like that yet, think about how it would transform your world if you did.
I just want to say thank you to the panelists and all of you who came to listen and participate and ask questions. The thing that's coming to my head right now is about kind of off of what Father Brad said, and that is kind of like, what kind of ancestor do you want to be? And when you think of yourself, when history is written later, what kind of thing do you want to have them say about you? Are you going to say, oh, that church was silent when all these things were happening? Or, oh, that church participated in the oppression of other people by, whatever. Or did that church transform their community and really sacrifice something great to create change?
Thank you. And I want to say thank you to everybody, and especially to Easton Davis, who has been our moderator and technical assistant person, and who is my mentor for moving me into the 21st century with technology. Thank you so much, Easton, for the work you do, because if I didn't have your assistance, this webinar would not have happened. And so I'm really very appreciative. And thank you, Bishop Rob, for your courageous leadership in this diocese and your support of the Center for Racial Healing, and all of us who are trying to do our best to help create space so that beloved community can have a possibility of being born. The last word I want to say comes again from Rilke, who's one of my favorite poets. And when he was writing to the young poet who kept questioning him about reality and the way ahead, he said back to him, and you can find this in his letter to a young poet, learn to be patient toward all that's unsettled in your heart, and learn to ask questions and to love those questions. Because if you learn to live and love those questions, you might live into some answers. I think that this era of pandemics is asking us to ask new questions and to listen carefully for the answers. And it's going to take a little bit of living and loving for us to do that. And God bless you all who joined us as you open yourself up to the questions. And do remember to make a contribution to our sisters and brothers that we have spoken about today that have such great need, and we can share out of our resources. May the good Lord bless everybody, and may we be just a little bit braver today after this time than we were before. God bless you.
Thank you, everybody. Good to meet you all.
Bye.
Good
Bye-bye.
to meet you all. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Easton, can you stay a second so I can ask you a question?
Let me just give you a call. That might be a little bit easier. I
Okay.
saved the chat and I got the questions. All right. God bless. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.